It was a quiet morning at the roadside diner, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint hum of chatter and the occasional clatter of utensils. Old, faded photos of local landmarks adorned the walls, their stories long forgotten by most who passed through. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. But today something different was brewing. The bell above the door jingled sharply as it swung open, breaking the lull in conversation. In walked a group of bikers, their leather jackets emblazoned with patches that spoke of loyalty, rebellion, and a life lived on the edge. They moved with the kind of swagger that turned heads and quieted rooms, their boots thudding heavily against the worn linoleum floor. Laughter followed them like a shadow, loud and brash, filling every corner of the diner. At the far end of the counter sat an elderly man, his back slightly hunched but his posture still carrying a quiet dignity. His hands, weathered by years of hard work and time, cradled a steaming mug of coffee. He was dressed plainly, in a flannel shirt and a well-worn hat that bore the faded insignia of the Vietnam War. He was a regular here, the kind of person who came and went without much fuss. Most days he kept to himself, offering a kind smile or a polite nod to those around him. But today, he seemed particularly still, as if lost in thought, the lines on his face telling stories no one dared to ask about. The bikers, loud and boisterous, made their way to the counter, their voices cutting through the diner like knives. They laughed and joked, their presence commanding attention. It wasn't long before their eyes fell on the elderly man, sitting quietly at the end of the counter. Something about him seemed to amuse them, or maybe annoy them. One of them, a tall man with a beard that seemed as wild as his demeanor, nudged his companion and nodded toward the old man. "What's up with Grandpa over there?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The others laughed, their voices echoing like a bad joke told too many times. The old man didn't respond, didn't even look up from his coffee. He simply sat there, calm and composed, as if the world around him didn't exist. But the bikers weren't the kind to be ignored. They sauntered over, their boots scuffing the floor with each deliberate step. The tallest one leaned on the counter next to the elderly man, his presence looming like a storm cloud. "Hey, old-timer," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You deaf or something? We're talking to you." The man finally looked up, his gaze steady and calm. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, held the kind of depth that made you think twice about what you were doing. But the bikers didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. "What's with the hat?" another one chimed in, pointing at the faded Vietnam insignia. "You trying to play war hero or something?" The old man didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, his hand steady despite the tension crackling in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "It's not just a hat," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "It's a reminder." The bikers exchanged glances, their smirks faltering for just a moment. But the silence didn't last. The tallest one leaned in closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "A reminder of what? That you were some big shot back in the day? Newsflash, old man. No one cares." The room seemed to hold its breath as the tension thickened. The old man didn't flinch, didn't waver. He simply set his coffee down and looked the biker straight in the eye. "A reminder," he said slowly, "of the sacrifices people like me made so people like you could have the freedom to act like fools." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. For a brief moment, the bikers seemed taken aback, as if they hadn't expected the quiet man to push back. But their bravado quickly returned, their laughter ringing out once more. "Sacrifices, huh?" the bearded biker said, sneering. "How about we sacrifice that coffee of yours?" Before anyone could react, he reached over and grabbed the man's mug, tilting it just enough to spill some of the steaming liquid onto the counter. The other bikers howled with laughter, their voices grating against the silence of the room. The man remained still, his expression unreadable. And then, as if the humiliation wasn't enough, one of them spat into the mug, their act as deliberate as it was cruel. Gasps rippled through the diner, the other patrons frozen in shock. The bikers, pleased with their display, laughed louder, their voices echoing off the walls. The old man said nothing. He simply stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, His hands rested briefly on the counter, steadying himself as he rose to his full height. Though he was smaller and older than the men who had mocked him, there was something about the way he carried himself that demanded attention. "Guess you're not so tough now, huh, old man?" the tallest biker taunted, his voice dripping with false confidence. The old man looked at him, his gaze unwavering. And then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small but unmistakable. A worn medal, its surface glinting faintly in the diner's dim light. He placed it on the counter, its presence silencing the room once more. The bikers stared at it, their laughter fading as the weight of what they had done began to sink in. The medal wasn't just a symbol. It was a story, one that spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and a life lived in service of others. It was a story they hadn't bothered to understand before mocking the man who bore it. The diner was quiet now, the only sound the faint hum of a coffee machine in the background. The old man picked up his hat, placed it back on his head, and turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, he paused and looked back, his voice steady and calm. "Respect isn't something you demand," he said. "It's something you earn." And with that, he stepped out into the crisp morning air, leaving the bikers and everyone else in the diner speechless. But what happened next would change everything. And it's a story you won't want to miss. Stay tuned to find out how this unexpected encounter took a turn no one could have predicted. The door of the diner creaked shut behind the old man, leaving an almost eerie silence in its wake. The patrons inside exchanged nervous glances, some murmuring quietly, unsure of what to make of what had just unfolded. The bikers, though still clustered together, had lost their earlier confidence. Their loud laughter was now replaced by awkward shuffling and low, uneasy grumbling. The metal on the counter glinted faintly, catching the light as if it, too, demanded attention. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, finally broke the silence. She walked over to the counter and picked up the medal carefully, cradling it in her hands as if it were something sacred. She looked at the bikers, her expression a mix of disappointment and quiet anger. "Do you even know what this is?" she asked, her voice sharp but calm. She didn't wait for an answer. "That man didn't just wear that hat for show. That's a Purple Heart. It's awarded to soldiers who were wounded or killed in action. That man put his life on the line for this country, for all of us." The words hung heavy in the air, and even the most defiant of the bikers looked away, unable to meet her gaze. One of them, a younger man with a nervous edge, mumbled something under his breath, but it was lost in the tension that filled the room. The waitress shook her head, a mix of sadness and frustration etched on her face. She carefully set the medal back on the counter, then turned her attention to the other patrons. "Does anyone know his name? Someone should make sure he's okay." A man sitting in a booth near the window spoke up, his voice hesitant. "That's Mr. Harris. Lives just down the road. Comes here almost every morning. Quiet guy. Keeps to himself." The waitress nodded. "Well, someone ought to check on him. After what just happened." Her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. The room was quiet again, the weight of guilt and regret palpable. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado now completely stripped away. The tallest one, the leader of the group, scratched his beard and looked down at the counter. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something. Maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, but the words never came. Meanwhile, outside the diner, the old man, Mr. Harris, was walking slowly down the road. The crisp morning air bit at his face, but he hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events that had just unfolded. He wasn't angry, not exactly. Over the years, he'd grown used to being overlooked, underestimated, even disrespected. It wasn't the first time, and he doubted it would be the last. But something about today had struck a nerve. Maybe it was the blatant cruelty of the bikers, or maybe it was the fact that no one had stepped in to stop them. Either way, it weighed on him. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to a time long ago, to a different kind of noise. The deafening roar of helicopters, the crackle of gunfire, the shouts of men fighting to survive. He had been so young then, barely more than a boy, thrust into a world of chaos and violence that he hadn't been prepared for. Vietnam had been a nightmare, a blur of fear and loss that had left scars far deeper than the ones on his body. But it had also taught him about strength, resilience, and the value of standing up for what was right. Those lessons had stayed with him, shaping the man he had become. And though he rarely spoke of his experiences, they were always with him, a constant reminder of the sacrifices he and so many others had made. He reached up to adjust his hat, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric. It wasn't just a hat. It was a symbol of a past that still lived within him, a past that he refused to forget. Back at the diner, the atmosphere was still tense. The bikers had fallen into an uneasy silence, their earlier bravado completely gone. The waitress, now back behind the counter, was cleaning up the spilled coffee, her movements quick and deliberate. She didn't look at the bikers, didn't acknowledge them at all, as if they weren't even there. One of the other patrons, a man in his 40s with a weathered face and a trucker's cap, finally spoke up. "You know," he said, his voice steady but firm, "you boys should be ashamed of yourselves. That man's a hero, and you treated him like dirt." The bikers didn't respond, but their silence spoke volumes. The man shook his head and turned back to his coffee, muttering something under his breath about respect and decency. Outside, the morning was growing brighter, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Mr. Harris reached his small house, a modest place with a neatly kept yard and an American flag flying proudly on the porch. He paused for a moment, looking up at the flag as it fluttered in the breeze. It was a ritual of sorts, a moment of quiet reflection that helped him center himself. As he stepped inside, the familiar comfort of home wrapped around him like a warm blanket. The walls were adorned with photos and mementos from his life, a younger version of himself in uniform, his late wife smiling in a frame, his children and grandchildren captured in candid moments of joy. Each one was a reminder of the life he had built, the people he had loved, and the sacrifices he had made. He set his hat on the table and sat down in his favorite chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The encounter at the diner still lingered in his mind, but he tried to push it aside. He had learned long ago that dwelling on anger or bitterness served no purpose. Life was too short, too precious, to waste on negativity. But even as he tried to let it go, a question lingered in the back of his mind. Why had they done it? What had he done to deserve such treatment? And, perhaps more importantly, what could he do to make sure it didn't happen again, not just to him, but to anyone else? Unbeknownst to Mr. Harris, the events at the diner were far from over. Inside, the bikers were still grappling with the aftermath of their actions. The waitress's words, the reactions of the other patrons, and the weight of the medal left behind. It all hung over them like a cloud, refusing to be ignored. The leader of the group, the tall man with the beard, finally broke the silence. "We screwed up," he muttered, his voice low and reluctant. The others looked at him in surprise, but none of them disagreed. "What do we do now?" one of them asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The tall man didn't answer right away. He stared at the counter, his expression troubled. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his actions had consequences, that his bravado and cruelty had hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Finally, he looked up, his jaw set with determination. "We fix it," he said. "Somehow we fix it." But how could they make amends for what they had done? How could they face the man they had humiliated and find a way to make things right? The answers wouldn't come easily, and the road ahead would be far from simple. But one thing was clear. The story was far from over. The diner settled into a strange, uneasy quiet after the tall biker's declaration. The patrons who had witnessed the humiliation of Mr. Harris were still processing what they had seen. Conversations resumed, but the usual light-hearted chatter was replaced by subdued tones and glances toward the counter where the bikers lingered. The medal remained there, untouched, a silent witness to the aftermath. The bikers sat huddled together, their previous camaraderie now fractured. None of them seemed eager to meet the gaze of the others, each lost in his own thoughts. The leader, the tall man with the wild beard, was particularly restless. He kept fidgeting with a napkin, tearing it into shreds as his mind churned. "We really messed up, didn't we?" one of the younger bikers finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as if speaking the words out loud would somehow make them less true. The leader didn't answer right away. He stared at the torn napkin in his hands, his brow furrowed. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and nodded. "Yeah, we did." The waitress, who had been wiping down the far end of the counter, glanced their way. She didn't say anything, but the look she gave them spoke volumes. It wasn't just anger. It was disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than any insult. The leader felt it like a punch to the gut. "We gotta fix this," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know how, but we can't just leave it like this." The others exchanged uncertain glances. "How do you fix something like that?" one of them muttered. "We can't take back what we did." The leader ran a hand through his beard, his frustration evident. He didn't have an answer, and that realization gnawed at him. For years, he prided himself on being in control, on projecting strength and confidence. But now, confronted with the weight of his actions, he felt small and powerless. Meanwhile, back at his small home, Mr. Harris was trying to move past the morning's events. He sat in his chair by the window, staring out at the quiet street. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, some painful, others bittersweet. The medal, which he usually kept tucked away in a drawer, felt heavy in his absence. It wasn't about the object itself, it was about what it represented. He thought about the men he had served with, men who had fought and bled and died in a place far from home. He thought about the promises they had made to each other, promises to never forget, to honor the sacrifices they had made. And now, sitting alone in his quiet house, he couldn't help but wonder if those sacrifices had been in vain. The sound of an engine broke through his thoughts. He turned to look out the window and saw a motorcycle cruising slowly down the street. For a moment, his heart quickened, but the bike passed by without stopping. Still, it left him with a sense of unease, a reminder that the world outside was not as quiet as it seemed. Back at the diner, the tall biker had come to a decision. He stood up abruptly, drawing the attention of the others. "We're going to his house," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "What?" "Why?" one of the bikers asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. "Because we owe him an apology," the leader replied. "And I'm not waiting around to do it. If you don't want to come, fine. But I'm going." The others hesitated, but one by one, they stood and followed him. As they walked out of the diner, the waitress called after them. "If you really mean it," she said, "don't just apologize. Show him you're sorry." The leader paused, her words echoing in his mind. He nodded once, then pushed open the door, the bell jingling faintly as they stepped outside. The ride to Mr. Harris's house was a quiet one, the roar of their engines the only sound. The bikers followed their leader, their earlier bravado now replaced by a somber determination. None of them knew exactly what they were going to say or do when they got there, but they knew they had to try. When they arrived, the group parked their bikes a short distance away, not wanting to intimidate him further. The leader approached the small house first, his steps heavy with apprehension. He hesitated at the edge of the porch, then took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Inside, Mr. Harris froze at the sound. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock was firm, deliberate. Rising slowly, he walked to the door and peered through the small window. His expression hardened when he saw who it was. Opening the door just enough to face them, he spoke in a voice that was calm but edged with steel. "What do you want?" The tall biker removed his helmet, holding it under one arm. He looked down, then back up at Mr. Harris, struggling to find the right words. "Sir," he began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, "we came to apologize. For what we did. It was wrong. You didn't deserve that." Mr. Harris regarded him silently, his piercing gray eyes studying the man before him. He didn't say anything, letting the weight of the moment settle. The biker continued, his tone earnest. "I don't expect you to forgive us. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And if there's anything we can do to make it right, we will." The other bikers, standing a few steps behind their leader, nodded in agreement, their expressions serious. For a long moment, there was only silence. Finally, Mr. Harris spoke. "You can't undo what's already been done," he said, his voice steady. "But maybe you can learn something from it." The leader nodded, his gaze unwavering. "We will, sir. I promise." Without another word, Mr. Harris stepped back and closed the door. The bikers stood there for a moment, uncertain of what to do next. The leader turned and walked back toward his bike, his expression thoughtful. As they rode away, the weight of the encounter hung over them, each of them reflecting on the choices that had led them here. None of them could change the past, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward. The story wasn't over yet, and the next chapter would be one of redemption, if they were willing to earn it. The sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, but the weight of the encounter lingered in the quiet of Mr. Harris's home. He sat back in his chair by the window, staring out at the empty street. The apology had been unexpected, and though their words seemed genuine, he couldn't shake the unease that gripped him. Actions, he knew, spoke louder than words. He'd seen plenty of promises broken in his time, and while he wanted to believe they meant what they said, trust wasn't easily given. His thoughts wandered again, back to the heat and chaos of Vietnam. He remembered the faces of his comrades, their laughter and fears, their courage in the face of unthinkable odds. They had fought for each other, not just for a cause or a flag, but for the bond that only soldiers could understand. It was that bond that had carried him through the darkest moments, and it was that same bond he felt missing in the world around him now. Across town, the bikers pulled into the garage where they often gathered. The mood was somber, the usual banter replaced by quiet introspection. The leader, still clutching his helmet, leaned against his bike and stared at the concrete floor. The others watched him, waiting for him to speak, but he stayed silent. Finally, one of the younger bikers broke the silence. "Do you think he'll ever forgive us?" The leader looked up, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said. "And I don't blame him if he doesn't." Another biker, a wiry man with a sharp tongue, crossed his arms. "So what now?" "We said sorry. Isn't that enough?" The leader's gaze hardened. "Enough? You think an apology is enough to make up for what we did? For the way we humiliated that man?" He shook his head, his frustration evident. "We didn't just disrespect him. We disrespected everything he stands for. That man's a veteran. He's been through things we can't even imagine. And we treated him like garbage." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. One by one, the bikers began to nod, a shared understanding passing between them. They had crossed a line and they knew it. But knowing wasn't enough, they needed to act. The leader straightened, a spark of determination in his eyes. "We're going to show him we mean it," he said. "Not just with words, but with actions. We're going to make this right." "How?" one of them asked, his voice skeptical but curious. The leader didn't answer immediately. He was already forming a plan, piecing together ideas that might help bridge the gap they had created. He knew it wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be quick, but it was necessary. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. Meanwhile, the small town was beginning to buzz with whispers about what had happened at the diner. Word traveled fast, and before long, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. Reactions varied. Some were outraged at the bikers. Others were impressed by their attempt to apologize. But most agreed on one thing: Mr. Harris deserved better. At the diner, the waitress found herself fielding questions from curious customers, each one eager for details. She answered as best she could, but her focus remained on Mr. Harris. She couldn't shake the image of him standing there, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had endured. She wanted to do something for him, but she wasn't sure what. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a quiet determination settled over the town. Unbeknownst to Mr. Harris, a few of his neighbors had begun to discuss ways to show their support. They didn't want to intrude on his privacy, but they felt compelled to honor him in some way. The bikers weren't the only ones looking for redemption. It seemed the entire community was grappling with how to make amends. At the same time, the bikers were putting their plan into motion. They worked late into the night, their usual rowdiness replaced by focused determination. They didn't talk much, each man lost in his own thoughts as they labored together. It was a strange sight. These men who had always prided themselves on their rebellious, devil-may-care attitudes, now working with a sense of humility and purpose. As the hours ticked by, tension mounted. They knew they had one chance to get this right, one chance to show Mr. Harris that their apology wasn't just empty words. The leader, in particular, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had started this, and he was determined to see it through. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the bikers were ready. Their plan was simple, but it carried a weight of sincerity that they hoped would make an impact. As they prepared to head back to Mr. Harris's house, the leader paused, looking around at his group. "Whatever happens," he said, "we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. Not because we expect anything in return." The others nodded, their expressions serious. For the first time in a long while, they felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. As they rode through the quiet streets, the townsfolk began to take notice. Curtains twitched, and heads turned as the bikers passed by, their usual swagger replaced by an air of determination. People whispered among themselves, wondering what was happening, but no one dared to stop them. When they arrived at Mr. Harris's house, the leader dismounted his bike and approached the porch with measured steps. Behind him, the others carried a carefully wrapped package, its contents a mystery. The leader knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, Mr. Harris stirred from his chair. The sound of the motorcycles had roused him, and now, as he opened the door to face the group once more, he felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The leader met his gaze, his expression earnest. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "we're here to prove we meant what we said." Behind him, the others stepped forward, presenting the package with careful hands. Mr. Harris looked at them, then at the package, his expression unreadable. The tension was almost unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. The leader took a deep breath, knowing this moment would define everything. Mr. Harris stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the bikers and the package they held. He wasn't sure what to make of the scene before him. The leader's tone seemed genuine, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that lingered in the back of his mind. He had learned long ago not to take things at face value, especially when it came to people who had wronged him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The leader glanced at the package, then back at Mr. Harris. "It's something we put together to try to make things right," he said. "We know it's not enough, but we wanted to show you that we're serious." Mr. Harris hesitated, his instincts warning him to keep his guard up. But there was a flicker of something in the leader's eyes. Perhaps remorse, perhaps sincerity, that made him pause. Finally, he stepped aside and motioned for them to bring the package in. The bikers carried it into the living room, their movements careful and deliberate. The leader stayed close to Mr. Harris, watching his reaction closely. The package was placed on the coffee table, and for a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with tension, each side waiting for the other to make the next move. "Go on," the leader said softly. "Open it." Mr. Harris's hands hovered over the package for a moment before he finally tore through the wrapping. Inside was a shadow box, meticulously crafted and filled with items that told a story. There were replicas of his military patches, a folded flag, and a plaque with his name engraved alongside the words, "Thank you for your service." It was a gesture that spoke of effort and thoughtfulness, but instead of relief or gratitude, a flicker of anger flashed across Mr. Harris's face. He stood abruptly, the shadow box still in his hands, and turned to face the bikers. "You think this fixes everything?" he asked, his voice rising. "You think you can humiliate a man, degrade him, and then show up with this and make it all go away?" The leader took a step back, his expression stricken. "No, sir," he said quickly. "That's not what we're trying to do. We just wanted to show you that we understand how wrong we were." Mr. Harris's gaze was unwavering, his voice sharp. "Understand? Do you have any idea what it's like to serve your country? To watch your brothers fall in battle, and then come home to be treated like you're invisible? Do you know what it feels like to have your dignity stripped away over and over again?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier resolve now tempered by the raw emotion in Mr. Harris's voice. The leader opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Mr. Harris took a step closer, his hands trembling as he held the shadow box. "I don't need your gifts," he said, his tone softening but still firm. "What I need is for people to see me as a man, not as a target for their ignorance. I need respect, not pity." The leader nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with emotion. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right. We can't undo what we did, and no gift will ever be enough. But we're not here out of pity. We're here because we want to do better. We want to learn from this and make sure it never happens again." Before Mr. Harris could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. Everyone turned, startled by the sudden interruption. Mr. Harris moved to open it, his expression wary. On the other side stood the waitress from the diner, along with several of his neighbors. They held small candles, cards, and a large banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. Harris." The surprise was evident on his face as he looked from one person to the next. The waitress stepped forward, her eyes kind but serious. "We wanted to let you know that you're not invisible," she said. "You're a part of this community, "And we're sorry we didn't stand up for you sooner." The neighbors nodded in agreement, their faces a mix of guilt and determination. The banner was carefully unfurled, and the words glimmered in the fading light of the evening. It was a moment of unexpected solidarity, a stark contrast to the isolation Mr. Harris had felt for so long. But before anyone could bask in the warmth of the gesture, another voice cut through the air, sharp and accusatory. "What's all this about?" A man stepped out of the shadows, his posture tense and his tone confrontational. It was one of the diner's regulars, a man known for his loud opinions and lack of tact. "This some kind of guilt parade," he sneered. "The guy's been around forever. Why all the fuss now?" The atmosphere shifted, the tension palpable. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. The leader clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. But it was Mr. Harris who stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about guilt," he said, looking the man directly in the eye. "It's about recognition. It's about reminding people that everyone, no matter their age, their color, or their past, deserves to be treated with respect." The man scoffed, but before he could retort, the leader of the bikers spoke up. "He's right," he said, his voice steady. "And we're part of the reason this needed to happen. We messed up, and we're trying to make it right." The man looked at the bikers, then back at Mr. Harris, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation might escalate, but then he shook his head and muttered something under his breath before walking away. As the group stood in the fading light, the weight of the moment settled over them. The conflict wasn't over, but something had shifted. The tension that had hung over them since the incident at the diner was beginning to give way to a sense of possibility. The question now was whether they could truly turn this moment into lasting change. The group stood in silence for a long moment after the man disappeared into the shadows. The weight of everything, the conflict, the guilt, the attempts at redemption, seemed to hang heavy in the air. Mr. Harris, his gaze steady and his back straight, took a deep breath and turned to face the bikers and the neighbors who had gathered around him. "I appreciate what you've all done here tonight," he said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "But respect isn't just a one-time gesture. It's not something you give when it's convenient or when you're trying to fix a mistake. It's something you show every day, in how you treat people, no matter who they are." The leader of the bikers nodded, his face solemn. "We get that now," he said. "Or at least we're starting to. We can't change what we did, but we can change how we act moving forward. And that starts with being better, every day." As the bikers stood there, visibly humbled, one of the neighbors stepped forward. She was an older woman who had lived on the same street as Mr. Harris for years but had rarely spoken to him. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I've seen you sitting on your porch for as long as I can remember. And I don't think I've ever taken the time to say hello or ask about your story. That's on me." Mr. Harris's expression softened as he looked at her. "It's never too late to start," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The waitress, who had been standing quietly with her candle, spoke up next. "When I saw what happened at the diner, I froze. I wanted to step in, but I was scared. And I've felt awful about it ever since. I just want you to know, Mr. Harris, that I see you. And I'll do better, too." The atmosphere began to shift, the tension replaced by a sense of connection. One by one, the neighbors and bikers shared their own small apologies or promises to do better. Mr. Harris listened, his face calm but unreadable. He didn't offer forgiveness outright. He wasn't ready for that, but he acknowledged each person with a nod or a quiet word of thanks. As the gathering began to disperse, the bikers lingered for a moment longer. The leader hesitated, then spoke. "We're organizing a ride next week," he said, "to honor veterans in the community. We'd like you to join us if you're willing." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow, surprised by the invitation. He studied the man for a long moment, then finally nodded. "I'll think about it," he said. The bikers left soon after, the rumble of their motorcycles fading into the night. The neighbors slowly drifted back to their homes, and the waitress gave Mr. Harris a small wave before heading back to her car. For the first time in a long while, the street felt quiet in a peaceful way, rather than an isolating one. Mr. Harris closed the door and stood in his living room, staring at the shadow box still sitting on the coffee table. He reached out, his fingers brushing over the engraved plaque. There was still anger inside him, Still pain, but there was also something else. A glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The following week, the day of the Veterans Ride arrived. The bikers had worked tirelessly to organize the event, reaching out to local veterans and their families, and even partnering with a nearby Veterans Association. The turnout was larger than anyone had expected. The streets were lined with people holding flags and signs of gratitude, and dozens of bikers had shown up to participate. Mr. Harris stood at the edge of the gathering, watching quietly. He hadn't planned on coming, but something had drawn him there. The leader of the bikers spotted him and walked over, his expression hopeful but cautious. "Glad you made it," he said. Mr. Harris gave a small nod, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about." The leader smiled. "We've got a spot for you if you want to join the ride," he said, gesturing to a bike they had decorated with a small American flag and a sign that read Vietnam Veteran. Mr. Harris hesitated, his gaze lingering on the bike. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped forward. The leader handed him a helmet, and the crowd erupted into cheers as he climbed onto the back of the bike. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a connection to the people around him. The ride was a success, the rumble of motorcycles echoing through the town as they made their way along the route. But as they neared the end, something unexpected happened. A small group of older men and women stepped forward from the crowd, their faces lined with age but filled with pride. They were fellow Vietnam veterans, and they had come to stand in solidarity with Mr. Harris. As he dismounted the bike, they approached him, one of them holding out a hand. "We heard what happened," the man said, "and we wanted you to know you're not alone. We've got your back." Mr. Harris's throat tightened as he shook the man's hand. For so long, he had carried the weight of his experiences alone. But now, standing among these men and women who understood his journey, he felt a sense of relief he hadn't known he needed. The bikers watched from a distance, their faces a mix of awe and respect. The leader turned to his group and nodded. "This," he said, "is what it's all about." As the crowd began to disperse, Mr. Harris looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, and felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. The conflict that had started with humiliation and disrespect had led to something he never could have anticipated, a community coming together, not just to honor him, but to acknowledge their own capacity for change. And in that moment, he realized that while the scars of the past would always remain, the future held the promise of healing.